All right, folks. Now, well, my next guest actually had a chance to join the Federal Reserve. There were a lot of folks who blocked her way, and let's say maybe they were numbskulls. Let's bring in Independent Institute Senior Fellow Judy Shelton. Judy, it does feel like Powell is acting like he's powerless, like a deer in the headlights. What do you think is going on now, particularly after this week when things are changing more in the favor of the Fed, maybe at least getting a green light to cut?
Well, that's the problem. I think that Chair Powell has been intellectually one-upped in that for a guy who insists that Fed actions are data-driven, the data is showing that inflation is steadily coming down. And here you had a Federal Reserve that was absolutely committed to the idea that they would keep lowering rates as inflation was coming down, right up until they abandoned that approach shortly after the inauguration of President Trump. But the idea of tariff-caused inflation, which was being pushed by Chair Powell, starting with that Chicago speech, is turning out to be somewhat of a bogeyman. And I think we can understand why. The Fed was assuming that you could increase the price of imported goods and Americans would just pay it. And they wouldn't quit buying other things. And therefore the general price level would be rising because they would just pay that, the tariff, as well as everything else they wanted. But the irony is that our trade partners have been upset by tariffs because they're quite certain that Americans won't just pay the higher price. And that's the point. They would make substitutions or they would go without. So the Fed's logic is kind of falling apart when you look at the data because we are collecting tariff revenue, but not seeing a rise in inflation.
Yeah, we're on a path now for $270 billion in that revenue. Now, Trump reiterated yesterday he's not going to fire Powell, but he says he may be forced to do something else to help with rates. I know Besant's talked about this also. What could they do to sort of influence rates here?
Well, I'm a little reluctant to speculate, but I would say that the Fed is somewhat vulnerable and they could be put on the hot seat by Congress. And one way to do that is through this initiative by Senator Ted Cruz to call out the Fed for using payment of interest on reserves, on the cash balances of banks and money market mutual funds as a way to control the interest rate. And Senator Cruz did meet with President Trump about that last week in the Oval Office. And there is some support, and I've been pushing this idea for some time. I have met with some senators, and I just think they might pursue this idea that all of the money the Fed has been paying out since September 2022, it's over $600 billion, instead of going to the Treasury as remittances, which they're required to do by law, it has been going to these commercial banks, private companies, and mutual funds. And it turns out that over 40% of that money is currently going to foreign banks. Wow. So Congress may get involved, and I don't know if they need a go-ahead from the White House. It's possible there could be some pressure on the Fed. You know,
I love that. Judy, I mentioned it yesterday to a senator who had not heard about it. So you got to get down to D.C. and make sure everyone knows about this, because a lot of that money is there so banks won't lend to the general public. So banks say, well, how do we make up the money? Fed says, we'll give it to you. So how perverse is that? I can't let you go. I cannot let you go without asking about who might be the next Fed chair. Right now it's become something of a parlor game. And Polymarket has you with a 14% chance. I mean, let's talk about this for a moment. It's pretty impressive. I know you mentioned the word reluctant a minute ago. You may be reluctant to say who should be the next Fed chair, but you're up there right now in the rankings.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That was, my attention was drawn to that by someone. So I appreciate your noticing. No, what I wanted to say, to sidestep for a moment, is with regard to this issue of this commingling of functions in our government between Treasury and the Federal Reserve involving the payment of interest on cash reserves. I do have a piece coming out of the Wall Street Journal on Monday. So we do want to move forward on that idea. And I'm very honored to be at least mentioned in I won't say the top tier, but I'm glad to see my name put put forward, because I've always been very appreciative and honored that President Trump did nominate me to serve on the Board of Governors. That's 7 people. Not for the top job, but I'm happy to be considered in the rankings.
Well, Judy, I got to tell you, you're right up there with Besson in the betting polls, and you know, you've been amazing. You've been an amazing voice of reason. Thank you so much. Hope to talk to you again real soon.